everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well. Today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Ghostbusters Frozen Empire get the number one spot, making over $45 million in its domestic opening, over $60 million globally in its opening. And let's just say, even though this has propelled the franchise to about $1 billion at the box office, that is definitely missing a big part of this equation and a big part of the analysis, because ultimately this is the worst opening for a Ghostbusters film in the modern era. And even before you adjust for inflation, it actually made less than even Ghostbusters 2016. So we'll talk a little bit about what that ultimately means and where I think the future of this franchise is, especially with this film costing a cool $100 million, and whether I think the film is actually going to be able to make its money back. Long story short, let's just say it's not looking all that great, but it's still relatively early. We'll also talk about some of the second weekend numbers for films like Arthur the King and some updates on Kung Fu Panda, a new film featuring Sydney Sweeney, who some people are crazy about these days, called Immaculate, a horror film, and a couple other films. Before going any further, please make sure you smash that like button, line up that fire button over on Odyssey, and smash the rumble button as well. Also, make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification. That way you know every time a video or live stream goes live on the channel. So blessed Palm Sunday to everyone out there, the very beginning of Holy Week. I hope that your Palm Sunday has been fantastic. Tony over at Deadline, though, has not been all that fantastic because, as he says, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire propels the franchise past $1 billion, with the sequel opening to $45 million plus. No snowstorm or sour reviews stood in Ghostbusters Frozen Empire's path this weekend, as the Gil Kenan-directed, Jason Reitman-produced sequel minted a $45.2 million opening after a nice spike on Saturday from families. Yesterday came in at $16.8 million, 5% ahead of the Friday previews. If the numbers hold up, that's the second best start ever for a Ghostbusters movie after the 2016 female ensemble of Kirsten Wiig, Melissa McCarthy, Leslie Jones, and Kate McKinnon. And we can just honestly just imagine that that film doesn't even exist because it's just garbage for so many different reasons. And let's just say they've changed the name of that movie several times because no one really cares for it. No one really wants to see it, except for maybe a few people who like to troll on the internet. Going to the actual numbers.com, though, looking at these domestics, you can see $45.2 million. This is, again, about where people were expecting this film to open up to. Obviously, the numbers and Box Office Pro had a slight difference. The numbers, or the Box Office Pro, had the average they thought that this film was going to open up was around $39 million or so. They definitely had on that high end of it being around $45 million, and so it seems to have hit that, but this is definitely not nearly as much as you would hope to see for a film like this, right? You're not seeing massive growth in audiences. I like to use the example of a film like John Wick just because it's in my memory banks. If you look to the opening for that franchise, you look to the opening weekend of part one, you go to part two, to part three, you see consistently there's rising audiences, right? There's more and more people going to see every single subsequent release. And so that's ultimately a good thing. It means you're not only keeping the people you have, but it means you're growing your audience. Right now, it seems this is very much at a stalemate, right? This seems to be kind of very stagnant and is not really growing its audience all that much, at least looking at the numbers at the domestic marketplace. And so we'll talk further about worldwide numbers in a second and some more comparisons, but I did want to get that out there that this is, again, a decent opening for this movie, but with a $100 million budget, this film needs to make quite a bit more if it's going to have any hope of actually making its money back and justifying any potential future films. And based off of the movie itself, and I'm obviously not that crazy about the movie itself, it's just not a very good movie, objectively speaking. If you're a fan of the franchise, you might be able to find some joy in it because of all the member berries that they put in there, but it's still lacking a coherent story nonetheless. Turns out, though, it seems that it is just bringing out the same number of people as it has been before. Now, will it be able to reach the heights of some of the other films in the franchise even more recently, right? Obviously talking about from 2016, since any other film talked about with Ghostbusters is going to go back to 80s, 90s, and that's a very different marketplace altogether. So really the only metrics we can use, the only films we can really have as a comparison are going to be from that 2016 movie, and so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Dune Part 2 coming in the number 2 spot once again, continuing to have very strong holds, 38% hold in its fourth week of release, so this film is definitely performing very well. It is seeing some pretty similar holds to what we saw for films like Oppenheimer, with a big difference being that Oppenheimer obviously was able to make a lot more in the day-to-day performance because it came out over the summertime, and so more people were off from work, able to see those weekday performances, but it's still about 12% off domestically from where Oppenheimer was at the the same point of release, which is the reason why I'm still saying this movie probably not going to crack $900 million. I think somewhere between that $700 to $800, maybe $850 million tops is going to be where this film ends up, which is still very good for a film of this caliber. It still has not broken even, though, looking at my random crazy chart method, which we'll also talk about today. But it is just important to note that I do think it will get to that point, but it's not going to be a huge profit moneymaker. Now, this is just looking at it as far as the budget that's been reported, typical marketing costs, and not looking at the behind-the-scenes deals that might exist between Legendary and between Warner Brothers, right? Who's going to take the loss there? Who's going to get a win? Looks like Warner Brothers probably, as a distributor, will end up winning here no matter what. Probably already has won. But as far as the person profiting, or as far as, spending money on the film, mostly spending the most money on the film, on this project, I don't see how Legendary makes its money back, at least in the theatrical run of the movie. And that's something that's very important to distinguish between making money after the fact, right? Because that's what I talk about is, do films make money at the box office? Do they justify their existence, or do they need to have years, months down the road to actually recoup any investments? The number 3 spot goes to the number 1 film from last week, I should say, Kung Fu Panda 4. So this film dropped to 16.8 million. So as you can see, Dune Part 2, even though it's been out for an extra week, is now taken over from where Kung Fu Panda 4 was. So it just shows you how strong that film is performing. The new film from Neon, Immaculate, a new horror film, which I have no interest in because they're not my cup of tea, opened up to $5.3 million. So it's a roughly $10 million budget. It's being reported as being somewhere less than $10 million. So that's not a terrible start by any means. So it looked like it might make a little bit of profit down the road. And then the number 5 spot went to Arthur the King, which in its second week of release dropped 43%. Percentage-wise, not the worst drop-off that we've ever seen, but for a film like this, it definitely needed to make a little bit more if it had any hopes of breaking even. Right now, based off of the metrics we're seeing and based off historical standards, probably not going to see any money back. Some other films to give updates on are the films Cabrini, dropping another 50% or so, 49% officially in the third week of release, also dropping from over 1,000 screens. And so I think that drop not nearly as bad as it could be, right? If you're losing 1,000 screens and you're only dropping 49% from your previous weekend, that doesn't mean as bad as it does if you are still in those 1,000 screens, right? But still also not what they're wanting to see for a film that they spent $50 million to make. It's just not looking like it's going to be all that good. Now, again, this was a private financier behind the scenes. Angel Studios is the distributor of the movie, so maybe Angel Studios is going to be fine. But as far as the movie itself making money and justifying the $50 million that was made, who is to say? Now, this could very well be the case. They didn't really care about making all that much money. But as I always say, even when it comes to bigger budgeted films, like people like Martin Scorsese, who spent $200 million or roughly $200 million was spent on the whole process of the film Killers of the Flower Moon, you're going to want to make money. You're in the movie industry to, at the very least, make some break even, right? To justify your film's existence, you're usually going to be looking for that in some capacity. And so Cabrini, again, hard to say at this point, but not looking that great either. Also, another update, the film One Life. I got to see that one earlier this week. It's phenomenal. If you have a chance to see it, it's in limited release. Highly, highly recommend it. Anthony Hopkins does a phenomenal job. And it also tells a story that I had never actually heard of before and does it very effectively and very well. Definitely one of my favorite films to come out so far this year. And then we also have the second weekend numbers for the American Society of Magical You-Know-What, and that dropped to 66%, $440,000, a whopping $444,000 in its second weekend of release, only $382 per screen. Even Luca, which finally got a theatrical release from Disney, made $396 per screen. Just shows you how poorly this film is doing, but we have no budget yet, at least nothing that's been confirmed as of the recording of this video, so can take that with a grain of salt. Now, one thing I do want to talk about, of course, is Ghostbusters, because we've been talking about this movie and talking about how this really isn't the best opening, right? $61 million worldwide, $45.2 million in the domestic market. Now, just to give you a comparison, now this is with the adjustment for inflation factored in, just to give you a better understanding of where this film actually is. So if you go to 2016's Ghostbusters, when you adjust that opening for inflation, that's around $57 million at the box office. If you look at Afterlife from 2021 and adjust that one for inflation, you're still looking at $46.6 million. And then you have Frozen Empire. And so the reason why I like to adjust for inflation, because you could do the same thing also with ticket sales, take the average ticket price of 2021, compare that to the average ticket price of today, and you're going to see the same thing. You're going to see a drop. In fact, it might even be a more dramatic drop if you look at the ticket sales between even Afterlife and Frozen Empire, because again, there is a disparity. Between them. The point is, though, is that Frozen Empire is not performing as well as Afterlife did. That film coming out in November, this film coming out in March of this year. Ghostbusters 2016 had the advantage of coming out over the summer and also had some hype around it because people said, oh, Ghostbusters is finally back. And then all of a sudden realized, oh, Ghostbusters is not actually back because this isn't even a Ghostbusters movie. Some people picked that up from the trailers early on. Some people needed to see the film to be able to make that decision for themselves. But the point is that Empire is definitely not doing as well as one would think. If you look to, again, 45.2 versus 16, you can see that the only day that that Empire is actually able to edge any of these films out on is Sunday. Right now, the projected Sunday is edging out Afterlife just a little bit, but Afterlife has the run on the first Friday and first Saturday. Now, some people might say, what about the unadjusted numbers, the actuals? Again, you have to have at least the adjustment for inflation. If not that, then ticket sale prices. And either way, it's going to have the same effect. You're still looking at the film barely making more than Afterlife, but even ticket sales is going to be less. As I mentioned before, in order to have a successful franchise, you need to be able to not only keep your audience, but also to build upon it. Seems that even the people who are fans already of this franchise, not all of them showed up to go see this opening weekend. Right? Less tickets were sold for Empire versus what was sold for Afterlife. That is, I think, a very important factor, talking there about the domestic numbers, of course. So 61 million, again, not a death knell per se, but definitely not a strong start either on a film that needs to make probably $250 to $300 million just to break even. Dune Part 2 also has a bit of a problem because it costs so much to make, $190 million in this case, and it's still making the vast majority of its money from the international market. Now up to $44 million also being made from China, of which they only get 25% of the receipts. To give you a better understanding of this film, let's go to my random crazy chart. So this takes into account the fact that domestic takes from the box office for studios is about 55% of the total, international in general about 40% on average, and then 25% if you just take from China. So using those metrics, right, $233 million is what it's made so far domestically, $296 million is what it's made internationally without China, and it's made $44.3 million just in China. Taking those numbers into account, it's still about $26 million in the red. So it has been able to make more than what Dune Part 1 made, so that's a good thing, obviously, for it, and it still has a long way to go. The fact it's still performing well and holding strong, even with newer releases coming out. We'll see what happens when Godzilla X Kong comes out next weekend. I don't think it's going to be all that impressive, especially in the whole scheme of the MonsterVerse universe. But will Dune Part 2 be able to keep its audience that weekend, right? It hasn't had as much like-for-like audience as far as competition is concerned. It's still been able to drive a lot of people to also some of those rare premium format screens because people want to see this film on a IMAX, want to see this film on the biggest screen possible. But is it going to be able to do the same thing when a film like Godzilla comes into the fray? Interestingly enough, having a very similar producer behind the scenes as well, with Legendary being behind that. And so it'll be Warner Brothers versus Warner Brothers, Legendary versus Legendary. And so will it be able to hold? Now, I do think, again, by the end of its run, Dune Part 2 will be able to get to a break-even point, be able to make some profit. You might have already some people saying it has has started to make profit. And if you look at my own charting, because we love charting here, over at OMB Reviews, you can see, yes, if you take into account a typical 2.5 multiplier, which again is pretty standard, then yes, you're looking at the film being at roughly $59 million in the black. That's pretty darn good. The issue, of course, is the fact that the market today is still different. Valiant Renegade, shout out to him, has done a lot of great research on this, showing you not only the differences in ticket price, but also more importantly, how the overall deals made by studios, right? Having the different theatrical windows today. It used to be movies were in theaters a lot longer. So making 2.5 times your budget made a lot more sense as a break even. Now you live in a much more international market. So that becomes a much bigger factor than it was previously because more money is being made sometimes internationally than domestically. But then also you have to take into account those contracts between studios and between theaters is going to be also slightly different as well. And so based off his research, he has it being closer to about a 3 times multiplier, but it all depends on things like the budget, on things like the marketing, which can also differ and also be more versus, historical standards there too. The point being made is that Dune at best has made some money, a little bit of money, but more likely has still not made its money back yet. So we'll have to, of course, do that. And let's see if I can update this in real time. So right now it is still performing about as well as a film typically does. About 64% of its entire box office was the first 2 weeks of its release. It's made 3 times its budget at this point. So definitely in a strong place, but has still a ways to go. And it's because it's made so much more internationally than domestically. I still think it's going to break even. I think that even on my random crazy chart method, it's still also going to hit that point. But the question is just how much and how much profit does this actually mean for them all going forward. Going back to the worldwide numbers for a second, $268 million made by Kung Fu Panda 4. So again, for the budget, definitely a good place for that one to be. Immaculate, $5.3 million. Arthur the King in its second weekend dropping to $14.6 million. Cabrini at $16.4 million. One Life, great film, $28.2. Also Cabrini, great film as well. And the American Society, no one is actually going to see. Now, going back to the charts, because we do love those charts here, we can start to make some projections on box office for films like Arthur the King. So right now, this film is projected to make somewhere between $14.6 and $20 million and $29 million by the end of its run, on average being around $25 million, which means it's going to lose somewhere between 10 and 15 million. So it's not looking like Arthur the King is going to make its money back. It's going to be a slight loss for them as a studio. But again, it could be a lot worse for this movie, right? Could be a lot worse. And let me go ahead and update this in real time because we love doing things live here on OMB Reviews as well, just to give you a better understanding in that next column. So those are the numbers there. Now, we don't have a budget yet for American Society, and so all I can say is that right now it's going to make somewhere between 3.1 and 4.4 million. Based on how much it's dropping, it may not even get to that 3.1 million, but we'll, of course, wait and see. Once I have a budget, I can actually make some projections on what the film's losses will actually look like, but as of right now, nothing to be said at this point, and I'll go ahead and also update this one as well since the numbers is having issues auto-updating that one. Going to Ghostbusters, though, 61.6, as you can see, compared to some other films, right, it's a lot less than Kung Fu Panda 4. It's obviously a lot less than Dune Part 2's worldwide opening. It is also a bit more, about 10 million more than Madame Web. When you're only just barely beating the worldwide opening for Madame Web, again, I know it's Ghostbusters. I know that it's a little bit different. I know that we should be comparing it to something else. Let me go ahead and actually do that real quick because I think I should have Ghostbusters Afterlife in here. All right, so if you look back to Afterlife, $60 million what that film made in its opening weekend worldwide. So, hey, the film is definitely on track. But remember, that was all the way back, right? That was all the way back in 2021 that Afterlife came out, right? That the film came out to 60 million. And so the fact that it hasn't really built all that much, people will bring up the fact that this was still a year affected by COVID and all these other things. All the excuses that typically people will come up with does at least make somewhat of a good point, which is that this is still definitely not as much as they would like, right? You're not seeing really that much of an increase, especially when you look at ticket sales, especially when you look at adjusted for inflation numbers to give you a better understanding. In fact, if you adjust those numbers or look at ticket sales, this is a lot less still. So again, it's not a worst case scenario. You're not looking at, for instance, like Madame Web, which is making significantly less than even the worst performing Marvel films, but this is also still not great for Frozen Empire either. And as of right now, it needs to make $250 to $300 million or so to break even, depending on where it makes its money. And right now is around $113 million in the red. Immaculate around $11.7 million in the red, but it is a much smaller budget, around $10 million. It needs to make about 25 or so to break even. So I think that it has a chance of doing that, but it's also still got a little ways to go. And let me see if there's any other updates. Imaginary has now been able to break even and make a little bit of profit. Cabrini still a long way off, probably won't change anytime soon. Kung Fu Panda, $33.4 million in the black. Still a far cry from the other films, so this is still a much smaller movie compared to any of the other Kung Fu Panda movies when you look at the worldwide totals, ticket sales as well. But still, those are the numbers right now. And then we've talked already about Dune Part 2. But anyway, those are all of the numbers. What are y'all's thoughts? Do you think that Ghostbusters is going to be able to perform better than any of the other films? If you go ahead and look again to this comparison chart here, $229 million is what was made by Ghostbusters 2016, and that's looking at it unadjusted, right? If you adjust those numbers for inflation, and obviously some people this still triggers, $285 million what that film made, 2015 was what Afterlife made in 2021. If the film is not even able to get to the level of Afterlife, right, then we're talking about a very precarious situation because Afterlife cost $80 million. Right, so that film was actually able to perform well enough to break even, right? Would perform enough to be able to make a little bit of money, right? Especially down the stretch. Frozen Empire, it's not looking like that's going to happen when you add another $20 million to the actual budget. Now, again, what kind of deals were happening behind the scenes? Could a distributor end up making some money, but the actual producer lose money? It's still too hard to say at this point. I don't have a very good calculation for determining that because as far as distribution fees and other things like it, it's hard to actually have. Maybe Valiant Renegade can help me on that point. So if you're watching this video, sir, if anyone reaches out to him, hey, let me know if there's a way of being able to calculate that. But as of right now, it's definitely not looking all that great. But what are y'all's thoughts about the film? Again, I thought it was decent. I gave it a very low, decent score over on Critic List. If you want to see my full review, check that out there. And let me know your thoughts about that or any of the other things. Dune Part 2, how much do you think that's going to end at? Again, looks like right now it's tracking to definitely get to $600 million easily. And I think after that, probably ending somewhere around that $700 million range or so could obviously be more too. But still a lot of time left on the table. Let me know your thoughts about this and anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, a lot of that fire button over on Aussie, smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Always trip over myself. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your Palm Sunday, a blessed Holy Week, and as always, God bless. And now for a huge shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members for the month of March, starting off with Father Luca Illich, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel being Eagle Rider. Miss Mon Muses, check out her YouTube channel as well by the same name. Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name. Mr. Roy and the K-Man, check out the K-Man's website at xtheboundaries.co. If you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, or if you want your name listed at the end of every live stream and video, make sure to check out the top link in the video description on how you can find out where to join on Patreon, Subscribestar, YouTube channel memberships, pretty much anywhere that you can think of that you would have as a mainstream source to be able to support the channel. You have the means to do so, and you get also special perks like having access to an exclusive podcast that I do every single month, access to a giveaways channel that I host on my Discord channel, and also, of course, the ability to have your channel shouted out at the end of every single live stream. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, God bless.